Welcome to the Mike and Doug Show. I'm Doug. Hi, Mike.
Hey, Doug.
Wow, Jamie Dimon on the soles of his shoes, uh, pockets filled with gold, driving a gold carriage. I'm pretty sure he's got a cloven hoof as a foot because he's a demon. And now your research has revealed it. And I must admit, in the past few days, you keep calling up and I didn't have my computer working, so I couldn't do a show with you, but you kept telling me these things, and I just kept thinking, come on now, how is that even possible?
No,
And that no one seems to know that this guy who now says, yeah, I may run for president if I decide to control America, but that would basically be stepping down from JP Morgan Chase and my control of the world. But if I feel like it, yeah, I'll become the president. Not he'll run for the president, he'll become the president. Tell us a little bit about the research you've been doing demonstrating that Jamie Dimon is just as bad as any crown agent that we've come across.
okay, this is a work in progress. We're not done yet. We're still pulling down a lot of evidence. But I'm looking forward to discussing this with you because I'm observing a lot of things about uh, different elements of our social networking invention that are now showing up in this ESG technology approach propaganda. And so I've made some notes here. But this literally popped out as we were doing a little bit of investigation on First Republic Bank. Remember that? I think that was the second largest bank failure in history was First Republic Bank. And we just stumbled on an article that talked about the two largest uh, management funds that 2 weeks before Jamie Dimon announced that he was acquiring all the assets of First Republic Bank. This article talked about the two largest funds, namely Bailey Gifford, which is a well known mutual fund out of England, and another company, J.O. Hambro, capital management company. Uh, Between them, they held something a little bit less than 5% of the stock of First Republic. They were allowed to sell their entire holding 2 weeks before. And if you've read the previous article on Jamie Dimon, we discovered in 1893 that this Hambro company was uh, how do you say it, was declared by the crown to have a monopoly on the management of the first bank of the Bank of Athens. And in the research on Jamie Dimon's family, we discovered that his grandfather was a critical player in the Bank of Athens, both in Smyrna, Turkey, and then after the Turco Greco War in 1919, he moved to the New York and became the president, basically, of this Bank of Athens. And with those, we found that this relationship with the Hambro family goes way back over 100 years. And we had also known from investigating a lot of the propaganda that the British organized for the First War Propaganda Bureau in 1914. Some people call it Wellington House. And then that eventually became the Ministry of Information or Disinformation in 1916 under John Buchan. What was his first name? Um, who ended up being the High Commissioner of Canada. So anyway, we knew that Hambro family was quite involved with the development of propaganda in the UK, in addition to banking and also spying, because out of the 1909 Imperial Press Conference came MI6, MI5, GCCS, which became GCHQ, and the Empire Press Union. So the Hambro family is iconic of this fusion of banking, propaganda, and spying. And that's well known now in the record. And in fact, Sir Charles Hambro, who was around in World War One, then became the guy who formed which name? There's several names. The SOE, the Security Organization Executive for the British Empire. That became the OSS, which then eventually became the CIA. So the Hambro family is tied at the hip to all things bad that are going on in our world right now. And we also can see that they're associated with the Dimon family. So you can imagine when we saw this Hambro name popping out of the First Republic acquisition, we started digging. And let me bottom line what we've discovered. We've discovered that Jamie Dimon was definitely involved with insider dealing here because the First Republic Bank had this J.O. Hambro Capital holding, which was then liquidated. So you'd think they're out of the picture. No, they weren't. So if we start digging down through the beneficiaries of this transaction, we got to remember that the FDIC, you and me, the American public, bailed out First Republic. Jamie Dimon did not assume any of the debt assets. All those debts were absorbed by us, the FDIC. And therefore, anybody in his downline would also be a beneficiary of that transaction. So when you're doing that in an ethics world, if you've got relationships in your downline, you need to disclose those because the market needs to know that you have self-interest here. Well, that didn't happen here because as we started looking down through the beneficiaries, we quickly tracked to the UK and Australia for the true beneficiaries of the First Republic Bank bailout. And in fact, the chief stockholder, the second largest stockholder in J.O. Hambro Capital in the UK is JP Morgan Australia, and then also JP Morgan China. And then we see that both of those companies are owned by Perpetual Limited in Australia, with one of its subsidiaries being Trillium. And Trillium is a chief proponent or advocate, as they call it, in the world for the ESG scoring system for corporations going forward. And in fact, when we start looking at the number of companies that are created and active in the Trillium investment fund, what we see is a who's who of corporations in the world who, by applying for funding from Trillium, which, by the way, includes most of the banks as something they called the RAP fee. This is actually disclosed in SEC documents. It's called the RAP fee partners. I just wrote them down. Include Schwab, Morgan Stanley, BlackRock, Contella, Davidson, RBC, Merrill Lynch, LPL, Raymond James, Wells Fargo, UBS, and J.O. Hambro is involved in the RAP fees about 3 or 4 levels deep in this beneficiary list. So they sold their stock 2 weeks before the bailout. And then on the back end, they're making transaction fees as a RAP fee partner with Perpetual and Trillium. And it looks to me that Trillium is, if not the key leader, is one of the key leaders in the whole ESG movement worldwide. Because if you look at the companies that they're investing in, it's all the big box companies. And so there, I think we have finally discovered how these banks get such uniform compliance across all industry segments in this month we call, what do we call this month? Gay month? I mean, Pride Month. This is how they get their compliance. They're saying basically, if you don't comply with our ESG scoring, we're going to withhold funding from you. And of course, these companies can't do that because they're addicted to this this mechanism. So that's a little bit of a summary. I want to go back and then at some point talk about how they manage this ESG scoring, because I think it's fascinating with the background behind the development of social networking in general.
Oh, yeah. So let's summarize a bit. Silicon Valley Bank, the small investors still haven't been paid off. The large investors drew all their money out ahead of time. When JP Morgan Chase came in and bought it, they absorbed the assets and didn't have to pay for the liabilities
Correct.
because the FDIC supposedly came in. Remember, Biden over the weekend created a new federal agency to make sure that every single investor in Silicon Valley Bank would get paid off, and they haven't been yet. But we do know that the insiders were told ahead of time. They pulled all their money out, and then the assets went to Jamie
By the way,
Dimon.
that's illegal.
Well, of course it is. But then if the president does it, I mean, it's not illegal because he's the president.
Hmm.
And this ESG thing,
I
you're
didn't
so
get that
right.
memo.
Well, Biden is has pure and absolute impunity, and so does Hunter Biden, and so does everyone in the Biden family. That's just the way it is. They're not going to be prosecuted. In case you're holding your breath for the prosecution of Hunter Biden, let me go ahead and tell you: breathe out. He's not going to be prosecuted. Matter of fact, here's what already has happened. When Christopher Wray was asked to deliver the documents, he said, no, no, no. And then they said, you're in contempt of court. What did he say? It's a ongoing investigation. Therefore, I
Yeah,
can't
that's
reveal it to you because people will die if I
hmm.
tell you the truth. So it's the standard operating procedure. But this is fascinating. It's fascinating to me that Hambro, as big as, they're like in the same category as Coots and
There.
Rockefellers and Rothschilds and the Bank of England and other central banks of the world. These people are the most corrupt of all. And what happens to them when they fold? They just go to another dominion of the United Kingdom and hide the money in a different bank under different names. And then who absorbs it? Same old people, JP Morgan. And
Yeah.
for ESG, JP Morgan or Morgan Stanley is one of the biggest ESG auditors. But the biggest of all, of course, is BlackRock. But then every single bank, and this is the fascinating part about the ESG, which I'll go into in great detail here in a bit, but essentially, if you're found to not be in compliance, all that means is that the big banks are going to cut you off, cut
Right.
you out, and don't give you any money, stop any liquidity in your company, and basically crash you.
Right.
That's all it means. And who started all of this? Oh, well, we'll go into that in a minute, but let's stick on good old Jamie Dimon for a minute.
Okay. So let me go into a bit of background here. Have you ever heard the expression, you can't manage what you can't measure?
Mm-hmm.
Or another way of saying it is, you can only manage what you can measure. And in organizational consulting, that is a key concept, and that's a solid concept. And the idea is if you have no way of measuring whether somebody's being productive or not, then you have no way of managing what they're doing. So that is the general principle here. So back in the early 90s, before I started Leader, I was organizational development consulting, spending a lot of time in this area, and it was called executive information management. And another name for it was the balanced scorecard. And this was a concept that came out of Harvard. And as an engineer, the concept made sense to me in that you can only manage what you can measure. So what you want to give to the management of an organization are the facts that will allow them to better manage the resources that they have responsibility for. And so I developed a product called Scorekeeper, and it was a way of just keeping track or keeping score, much like you'd have with a console on a car. So, and you don't have to go and look under the hood every time you get into your car, because you have these gauges that are giving you information that tells you whether your vehicle is operating within the norms. And so that's a solid concept too. Everybody knows this. And so what we were doing at the time was developing ways of providing that information to an executive. And in the process of doing that, I started doing a lot of consulting on the balanced scorecard, because in general, in concept, it made sense. And then I was actually invited to speak in New York at the conference board at their third ever conference on balanced scorecard. So at this conference, we were presenting some of our early ideas, and there were a number of speakers. And one speaker in particular got up and he made a statement which really turned my head, because he said, and he was an accountant, and he said, eventually, once this balanced scorecard program is implemented in a corporation, we won't need managers anymore. No management, because our system, and that was what he was saying, our system is going to manage for us. And I walked out of that saying, okay, I'm full of hot air here, because this is not a way to manage people. You don't manage people by beating them over the head with statistics. And that's really what these accountants and programmers that were there were really saying, is that we're going to build a system where we will be able to beat over the head the people who work in this company with the statistics that we feed to them. And so it was essentially a power trip by accountants and programmers. And I saw with that no, balanced scorecard is going to fail, because if companies try to implement across the board, the workers themselves will sabotage that system. And in fact, that was already happening in the early 90s, that people were trying to figure out different ways to sabotage these reporting systems, because what they found was that most managers end up gravitating to using those statistics to beat people over the head like a club. And so if you want conformity, you pull out this balanced card report and you beat over the head of the people in your staff meetings until they comply with these formulas. And so what we saw was the sabotage really occurred at the data collection level, where the people were just feeding bad numbers into these systems. And so that's the way they undermined it. And I decided this is not a way to manage. And so what I started working on was a wholly different way of handling data. And I was determining that the best way of offering a system to people is to say, okay, here's a system, you can use it however you want. And you can use it to do the balanced scorecard or some other referencing system that we haven't even conceived of yet. And so the system was intended to be able to adapt to whatever the need was within a particular organization. And the person who owned that data would be the one who drove that decision, not some God in the sky who was this balanced scorecard expert. And at that meeting in the early 90s, I really saw that was going to be the trend, that you were going to see these accountants and their lawyers start using balanced scorecard to force people to comply with whatever behavior that you wanted them to do. Now, on a general level, who doesn't do that with their kids? You sometimes say, well, if you'll do this, I'll give you that, or we'll give you this treat if you do that. So the idea of having rewards for good conduct is age old. And so there's a flip side to this. But what I see with ESG is the end result of this balanced scorecard idea of beating people over the head. And they've applied it to the whole world, not just a company, but the banks have specifically developed the scorecard for a particular reason. And here's where I don't know if I'm going to shock people, but I think the reason for this ESG is that they're using this in the banks to replace war. Because as we have seen, war has been for many millennia the way that the banks shifted markets around and acquired assets cheap, built them up, created a new war, beat the assets down, built them back up, and they've been doing this cyclically for millennia. And so this is the new way of doing it. What they're going to do is they're going to take the ESG score. Now, I've pulled out of Jamie Dimon's company, Perpetual and Trillium, their list of the topic areas that they're going to score. And let me just read them to you. There's about 15. Climate, food waste, toxic chemicals, paid sick leave, racial equity audits, diversity equity, inclusion targets, political spending, democracy, LGBTQ plus rights, reproductive rights, worker rights, freedom of association, collective bargaining, technology, forced labor, and collaborative efforts. Those are the topic areas that the ESG is going to score. And so here is the gift to a bank. So once a company is tracking those particular measures in their system, in their ESG system, the bank will then know from the data whether or not that company is following their orders and following their directives or not. And here's how it becomes social warfare, because all they got to do is say, okay, in this particular area, we're going to punish this particular company for, let's see, inclusion, no diversity, no LGBTQ. Okay, so we're going to create a crisis for that company or for that industry around LGBTQ plus, and we are going to create winners and losers, and we're going to make sure that we've got our companies, this Perpetual Limited and Trillium, invested in the right companies to be the basket that creates the value out of this crisis that we created. Isn't that clever? They're using propaganda. Now they'll use propaganda to create the wars. They don't need kinetic wars anymore. They're going to use ESG to do this. In their pajamas, they're going to create conflict. And these companies they've created, like Trillium, like Perpetual, are going to be the mechanism by which they use propaganda to create continual bank value if you comply with their particular scoring system.
I think that's very insightful. I'm just disappointed I didn't think of it first. But yes, when you say ESG, first off, you have to add the C, ESCG. So it's environment, social, corporate governance. Now, when
But
it
by
was
the way, none of their documents have C in it yet. So we've got the freshest documents that they've issued, and they don't have the C yet.
That's right. And if you Google it, it'll come up with ESCG
Mm-hmm.
because they've now admitted that these are corporations. This isn't the government. This isn't anybody else besides corporations. And I'm going to demonstrate that and demonstrate that what you just said is true. First off, when this was created in the 1960s, it was created by a group called the United Nations Environment Program Initiative. And what they were saying is, if you have a company that supports tobacco use, you're going to be graded down. If you have a company that supports child labor, you're going to be graded down. If you have a company, say in China, that has child slavery, you're going to be graded down. And then we're not going to loan money to those companies. Remember in the old days when they said, oh, you can choose to put your money into funds in your 401k that are sustainable
Right.
companies. That's all lies. And the reason it's lies is because the auditors lie. These are the same auditors. They're the auditors who lie and create basically our new economic wars. So let's just take it one at a time. Environmental. Read that as climate change. This started in the 60s. Remember in the 60s, it was going to be the new ice age was coming. The ozone was collapsing. Then it was going to be too much heat. Everything was going to melt. And then it was going to be too much cold. And now it's just climate change. Every 10 years, they change the topic for what their focus for sustainability is. This all
Right.
comes back to the United Nations Agenda 21 or Agenda 2030, which is all about sustainable development, growth, and risk management. We don't want to take a risk with a company that doesn't do what the United Nations says, but don't get stuck on the United Nations, exactly as you told me earlier. This was all created in 2001, actually, but it was started in 2000. Who started it? the previous head of the US Fed, Paul Volcker. Where did he start it? In Canary Wharf. Canary Wharf is the head of the British uh, East India Company.
Right.
They were basically an independent sovereign area of London. And then 1 year later, well, it started off as the International Accounting Standards Committee. And then it moved and it became the International Sustainability Standards Board. And they created a foundation. Oh, they always create a foundation because then
Mhm.
it has to be good. It's a foundation. So now the foundation is the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation, which has 22 trustees on it. Paul Volcker was the chairman and started this in 2001. And where he moved it from Canary Wharf to the city of London. Surprise, surprise, huh?
And
But
he was a very active Pilgrim Society member
totally. And
with
remember,
Henry Kissinger.
these are the turkeys who tried the League of Nations so that the Brits could control the world. When that didn't work, they tried that one that you brought forth, the Pacific, whatever.
The
What's the name of that one? No one even knows that
Pacific,
one existed.
that's the one that was created by the YMCA.
And it became the United Nations. And then the United Nations, first off, I want to put in a little segue here, has never done a single good thing in its entire existence. As a matter of fact, they are creators of war. They are the most nefarious group on the face of the earth. Look at Tedros and the World Health Organization. Look at Antonio Guterres, the head of the UN, who was the High Commissioner for Refugees. He created the migrant invasion of Europe, and we could go into that, but that was to destabilize currencies. Okay, that was to destabilize the workforce. As you always point out, it's the big money is in the workforce. Well, let's remember only 2% of those invading migrants have worked. Less than 2%. Okay, so that's a complete myth. So what happened here? Then the United Nations basically said, okay, we're going to set up the Agenda 21, and by the year 2021, we're going to have what you just read, which is a twisted up, bastardized version of what the United Nations has as their 17 sustainable goals. I'm going to read them, and you listen to the difference
Okay,
in
I'm going
what
to mark him
Michael was
against my
reading,
list.
because this group, the what is called the International Accounting Standards Committee, or now it's called the International Sustainability Standards Board, they twisted those up and they made them very specific so that they could use it as a weapon, exactly as you said. These are weapons being used against smaller corporations so that larger corporations who already have the auditors, the ESG auditors, ESCG auditors in their pocket. And by the way, who's that? KPMG, JP Morgan, Bloomberg, Morgan Stanley, the SEC, and then many, many different NGOs like Morningstar and Sustainelec. But who's the biggest? BlackRock. And BlackRock is, of course, how can they determine? They own those companies. They have the controlling uh, percentages of those companies.
And
And
they're a
yet,
broker, on this ESG layering inside Jamie Morgan's deal, JP
exactly.
Morgan's deal.
But now let's look. In the
You're gonna
60s,
read, yeah, you're gonna read this list, right?
a different, it's the same list with a little different focus. And you can see that the focus, it makes it more modern so that it is impossible. That the Sustainability Development Growth Goals of the United Nations, you would have to be a complete and absolute ignorant fool to think you could ever do these things.
Right.
None of these things can ever happen. It's like Alexandria Ocasio Cortez's Green New Deal is nothing more than the UN sustainability growth goals for 2030. So all she was doing is parroting them. Now I'm going to read these, and I'm sorry, none of these are attainable. So how is it that your corporation can be refused bank money, government money, international money, the World Bank, the World Bank out of the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund, the Bank for International Settlement, all of them, hundreds of agencies from the UN tell you you have to comply with this. Okay, you tell me, you stop me, hold up your finger if a single one of these goals is possible. Okay,
Well, I need to mention that buried inside these companies is something called the ESG Global Conviction Team based in the UK. Now, this is an Australian company that's hired its subsidiary in Boston to manage itself, and the Global Conviction Team is based in the UK. See any pattern there?
Go
But I love
figure.
it. It's the ESG Global Conviction Team is going to read the list that I read, the one you're going to read, and they're going to decide to do whatever the heck they want to do to
These
create crisis.
these are accountants who are supposed to be, matter of fact, the ESG was supposed to be GES, governance. But here's the war. The war is, the governance is, these corporations pay no taxes. They fleece the nations that they work in, and they act as corporate sovereign entities that
Yeah.
cannot be touched by anybody. So they are creating the war, but they don't pick up any weapons. They don't do any work. They don't do a darn thing except pontificate and give platitudes, which then become lies, which then become demonic laws. So
They beat their constituency over the head with the numbers that they create out of this list. That's the
absolutely.
way they're doing
So let's look at environment. Can we do these things? No, we cannot. Climate change is so basically they're in a war against Mother Nature. So normal climate change is now an enemy that we must charge everyone. Tony Blair charges between 10 to 40 million dollars to go into a country and teach them to become ESG ready.
it.
And what is that? That is an accounting tool to figure out, just like you're talking about, what you helped work on. It's an accounting tool to say, okay, you use gas stoves, therefore that's a tick against you. You use this. Oh, you have an expensive car. Oh, you eat meat 3 times a week. Oh, this is the credit score that is being used on you right now through social media, but it's now for the governments, but it's international. Anything international is pure evil. Trust me. Anything international is pure evil because these countries do not agree on anything. So, how do you think you have an international group that agrees on something? So, they create the carbon footprint. And what is that? That's the new currency, folks.
Yep.
That's the new currency.
That's the number game that they're playing. They're going to attach this carbon number to all these different activities.
And then social. Well, social now, there are literally hundreds of non governmental organizations that can go to any corporation and say, you aren't diversified enough. You haven't hired any refugees. You haven't hired any migrants who've come across the southern border. You don't have enough blacks in your company, enough Hispanic people in your company. So basically, they can attack anyone, any NGO, which are supported by people like George Soros. 84 different NGOs he has support, well, actually 128 and $84 billion he has given to these NGOs so that they could attack, because this is a war. And so you have the
Right.
minority attacking the majority, and the minority always wins. So this is a rigged war to begin with, and it's with false flags. So basically, the social implementation of this is for a diversity. No, it's not. Name me 3 or 4 African American CEOs of major corporations. You can't. They don't exist. They're all a bunch of British white supremacists. It's just like, who started the group that makes this list and it creates the accounting measures for it? Paul Volcker. I mean, who, just take a look at the people who are involved in this. There's 22
Right.
trustees who make these determinations, and then the UN demands that it be implemented, and then the banks are the teeth in this. The banks and the gigantic asset management companies like BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, they're the ones who are enforcing this. Why? To close down smaller corporations, because their auditors have already said they're the best at ESG, when in fact their governance, which is another war, steals from every company they work in, every country they work in.
Yeah,
They pay no taxes.
one of the reasons this is going to kill small businesses, because small businesses aren't going to mess with that kind of accounting. And what we've seen is that all of this software that's being used to try to track this ESG scoring has come from England and is being implemented all over the place.
Absolutely. Now, raise your finger if a single one of these sustainability goals, and this is all about sustainability, but who is it sustaining? It's
It's the
sustaining the
banks,
corporations.
right?
And that's why you have to add the C, corporate governance. Who's it sustaining? These are tax thieves. These
Right.
are offshore account corporations. That's who this is all about. It's supporting them. They're the
Can
only
I
ones making
can I
any.
add? You say corporations, but I would say there's a layer above them, and that is it's sustaining the bank's monopoly over the population. And so part of that sustainability issue is, okay, we want the corporations to do it, but in the end, it's the banks who are, and they even can't even pick a new name, are creating perpetual profit by this new mechanism.
That's why that company is named Perpetual Unlimited or Perpetual Limited, but
Right,
it should be unlimited because essentially this is corporate fascism, it's economic fascism, it's economic slavery. And these people at the top who get wonderful audits, matter of fact, you say, who's the best at ESG? And they're going to give you the most corrupt
right.
corporations and banks in the world. Okay. So this is a war. This is a war based on carbon footprint. It's a war based upon shoving down our throat diversity under the auspices of migrant invaders need to now be given telephones. They need to receive full medical benefits. They don't even have to report back for 4 years now. So if you cross the border, you get in, you're good for 4 years. You live in a nice hotel now. You have everything paid for, and none of those people end up getting any work. It's not like DACA. It's not like the old invaders who used to come across our border, who in fact would sneak and get a job and steal somebody's social security number and pay taxes. And we know them. 22 million of these people have stolen social security numbers, and they pay taxes and get tax refunds. Please, this is so well known. It's ridiculous. Now, let's go into this. Raise your finger if you believe this can be attained by 2030. No poverty. Your finger didn't go up. Zero hunger. Oh, no finger. Good health. We don't even have
Good,
a health
good
industry.
idea.
We have an illness industry, okay? And the pharmaceutical companies make sure of that. Quality education. Oh my heavens, please don't raise your finger because it is going to hell in a handbasket right now, education. Gender equality. That's never going to happen with a Muslim country. It can't possibly happen. Women are chattel if you're Islamic. Impossible. So your finger hasn't gone up yet. But remember, AOC says the Green New Deal has to be incorporated because remember, how many more years do we have left? We only have 8 years left.
Hmm.
Why? Because that's when the sustainability growth goals must be attained by 2030, or else the world ends. No, their plan just gets curtailed. Doesn't even end. Okay, how about the next one? Clean water and sanitation. No, the number one problem in the world now is clean water. Are we doing anything about it? Nothing. How about ESG companies doing something about it? Nothing. Have ESG
Well,
companies done anything about poverty, hunger,
okay.
health, education?
Let me
Nothing.
just comment on clean water. There are so many, there's so much misinformation out there about water. I mean, civil engineers do a lot with water, and most of the people in the United States have access to fairly clean water. And so it's propaganda that is creating this crisis. Yeah, you can always have better water, clean water, different filters, that kind of thing. So I'm not saying it's perfect, but the point is propaganda can create a crisis. It's not there. And then you can punish companies that don't match your arbitrary, precipitous standards. And then you can punish that company. Its stock will go down. You've shorted that stock, so you make money.
Correct. Before their ESG condemnation comes, they buy or sell the stock they know that they've just manipulated into going up or
Right,
down.
right.
Just as you said, this is a war. It's clear and simple. And by the way,
It's the
clean
bankers'
water in
war.
America, they're working against clean water by putting reduced graphene oxide in on all the pipes and that bring the city water to people. So constantly, they could be doing all kinds of things. They could be desalinating the ocean like they do in Israel. All their water comes from desalination factories that or industry that nobody else in the world uses. Isn't that interesting? Anyway, so clean water, no. Clean energy, wind is not clean because you can't recycle those windmills. Solar is not. One of the most toxic things you can do is create solar panels, which then they don't degrade, and they have to be
We
buried.
haven't even we haven't suffered the problem with solar panels yet, and that's when they start going bad. What's going to happen?
Right.
Are all
And
these roofs that all have these nice shiny new solar panels? Is the government going to come along and replace the ones that go bad? I think that we're going to have a maintenance nightmare on solar
and
panels.
and where are they going to get the silver? There isn't enough silver in the world to create those. Uh, Electric cars, there's not enough electricity in the world to run the electric cars. So saying that all cars in California by 2025 will be electric is sheer insanity. Anyone who says that is a complete imbecile. I'm sorry, but they can't even have two brain cells to rub together. They're so stupid. And clean energy, they could have thorium replace all nuclear energy, and we could basically have
Right.
free energy. But no, they don't. Of course, they're working on the things that support the industries. So sustainability of their own industry. That's all it is. A sustained economic growth. Well, anyone knows that's not possible. Growth goes up and down. It doesn't keep going up. And if it keeps going up, you are going to crash so hard later, it's ridiculous. There's no
If you
such
look,
thing.
if you look at the First Republic Bank financial reports, it was nothing but up until the crash.
Look at Bitcoin, look at FTX, look at all the crypto coins. They just go up like
So
a
were the
helium
auditors
balloon.
lying, or were they in fact going up?
Well, we don't even know. We don't have any idea. These auditors are the worst liars on the face of the earth because they're controlled by the banks.
Right.
So no, you can't trust any auditor. Okay, how about oh, I love this one. Industry, innovation, and infrastructure. Innovation, they steal every patent they can, weaponize
Correct.
it, and it's only controlled by the big capital venture companies. There's no such thing as uh, basically innovation that isn't turned towards war, exactly as you said. Innovation, first and foremost, it has to be a weapon, whether it's a bioweapon, whether it's a physical weapon, doesn't matter. Any innovation is going to be turned into a weapon. That's just the way that it is. All right, how about this one? Reduce inequality.
There we go.
Reduce inequality. How about the
Well, that
oligarchs?
you can
How
pretty
about
much do whatever you want with that one.
that's my point. These are so nebulous. These are pie in the sky dreams. This is Luciferism on in its worst example.
There you go.
And essentially, the inequality. You're not going to change the fact that the billionaires run the world. They pay no taxes. They fleece every nation that they're involved in. You're not going to change that inequality. You can't get two nations to agree on anything. They, what nation hasn't been in a war with their neighbor? There's no such thing. We're not going to be equal. There's not going to be
Well, I don't know. I think
diversity.
the nature of war might change as what we're talking about becomes better known, and we find different ways of managing our cash and our fiat currency. Once we get the banks out of the middle, maybe we can start living more full lives where some of these standards that we're talking about here can actually be implemented, but it's certainly not going to be enforced by these greedy bankers.
Sustainable cities and communities. That's the 15-minute cities they're trying to do, which is, again, what's stupid. If you're in a 15-minute city and you don't have a hardware store there, then you have to use Amazon, don't you? In other words, the big box companies are the only ones who benefit by 15-minute cities. Complete insanity. Getting rid of internal combustion cars is the intent of 15-minute cities. All of that is impossible. It's stupid. And anyone who believes in that just really, I don't think there's any hope for you. I really don't think there is. Okay. Oh, I love this. Responsible corporate production. First off, what does that even mean? Second off,
Yeah, that's
corporations are not responsible. They can murder you. They can murder you and no one goes to jail because corporations are held higher than the human individual in a court of law here in America. It's absolutely ridiculous. Climate action. You as a corporation need to be changing the climate. First off, you can't change the climate except for negative. Matter of fact, all those fires up in Canada, which, practically blacked out Times Square in New York City. What is that? Those were obviously all set at one time. So it's an attempt for Trudeau to block out the sun. That is their intent. That's the intent of the United Nations environmental groups. Block out the sun because the sun is our enemy. Oh my heavens. That's how absolutely ridiculous this is. And then I love this one. Life below water. We are destroying the oceans faster than you can shake a stick at them. And we aren't doing anything positive with the oceans. We could live off the oceans. No,
What does that mean, life below water? Human beings living below water or preserving the fish life?
that's preserving the fish life. And
Oh,
it should
okay.
mean humans living underwater because we could. Instead of going out into space, why should we? The great mystery is the ocean.
It's very expensive to do that.
Yeah, of course it is. And then life on land.
Oh, okay.
What the heck does that mean? What that means is Bill Gates
This
buying up
isn't virtuous.
farmland so he can stop farming, so they can stop the farmers in the Netherlands, so they can stop the farming in Ukraine, so they can stop everything on land. In other words, taking away your food. So I'm sorry, when it says zero hunger, you can't do the policies that we're seeing from these corporations with life on land and still intend to feed people. It's
Well,
not
they
going to
never
work.
claimed this was logical. These are just virtue signaling points where they've taken all their polling and they've discovered all the weaknesses in human thinking, and they've got a label for each one of those so that they can trigger an emotional response.
How about this one? By the way, I haven't seen your finger go up yet. 16 is Peace and Justice Institutes.
Hmm.
In other words, oh, you mean those philanthropic groups like the Prince's Trust that tries to tell you they're saving animals when they're killing animals? So these are foundations, these are philanthropic institutions that are for peace and justice. Anytime the word peace and justice is in it, you can guarantee it's supported by
Well,
George Soros.
uh, we discovered the actual organizing documents of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and one of the things that Carnegie specifically specified that anything he funded had to have the word peace in it somewhere, because those propagandists back then knew that peace was a trigger word. And so ever since then, that has been the trigger word. And you're right. I mean, it's nothing but virtue signaling here. There's no substantive aspect of this. This is why I say let's get rid of all these politicians, lawyers, and accountants, and let's put civil engineers there because we don't put up with this kind of nonsense.
Absolutely. 17th goal, I don't know, maybe your finger will go up on this one. Partnership with others to accomplish these goals. In other words, the United
Good.
Nations.
Partnership. Okay.
Now, let's remember this all started with in 2005 when this committee of the United Nations, actually, it was after Ron Volcker started his group that basically,
Paul
um,
Volcker.
what did
Paul
I call
Volcker.
him?
You
Paul
call him
Volcker.
Ron.
Oh no, Ron Volcker. I used to know a guy named Ron. Sorry, Ron Volcker. Paul Volcker. Okay, he started this so that they could have international standards for accounting, right? In other words, loopholes for the corporations so that the auditors can have false balance sheets and false assets and loan out gold and silver for manipulation, for derivative
Right.
manipulation through banks. That's what partnership for these goals is all about. But this started after Paul Volcker decided he was going to control all international auditing, and then a little group, and I looked them up, and it was so cute. Every one of them looks, I won't use derogatory terms because then I would not be sustaining these 17 sustainability goals. But every one of these people that was on this committee that was called the United Nations Environment Program Initiative, every one of them was a screaming liberal. You can just tell by
Mhm.
looking at them. You go, "Oh, well, they wear that to work? Holy, who are these people?" And then what did they come up with? They came up with this phrase, "Who cares wins." Who cares? Now, here's the way that it should
More
be read.
virtue signaling.
Yeah, exactly. Who cares? We win. That's what it should have been called. But what it's saying is if you have propaganda that says you care about diversity and you care about the climate and you care about proper economic governance and you care about corporations, then you win. Because why? You're virtue signaling. You have done your propaganda. You've controlled the mainstream media so that you're never ever questioned. Uh, but you know, like a Larry Fink from BlackRock, he's one of the most evil people on the face of the earth, right up there with Jamie Dimon. These people are pure evil. So this is their agenda, and this agenda is stupid, and are all it are it's a bunch of bombs. It's a bunch of bullets. It's a bunch of landmines. It's nuclear weapons against the person who goes out and works every day, makes money, pays their taxes, have don't they don't have enough money to get their teeth fixed. They don't have enough money to send their children to school. It's a war against those people. And
Right.
the reality is the DEI people, the diversity, equity, and inclusion people, anyone, just like recently happened with the boycotts of Target and of Bud Light. Anyone can actually say this is a bunch of nonsense and attack those corporations, and it will lower their ESG score. Now, let me just point out BlackRock is in control of over $13 trillion in companies that are ESG compliant. If you take all the companies that have been ESG compliant with fake audits, it's $35 trillion in assets. Now, look at the analysis. Oh, you look at BlackRock's analysis or Bloomberg's analysis or the SEC's analysis, they're going to say this risk management for sustainable companies is so good that it has increased their wealth by 90%. Look a little closer. You're going to find out it lost 60%. So they just lie. These are just big, fat, friggin' fascist economic lies. These are
Yep.
economic predators. The reality is what we just happened with the boycotting. If you want to go into diversity so much that you want to support 1% of America, which are transgender, or LGBT altogether is 3.5% of America. So if you want to take the minority and make the minority that which you're warring for, let's remember those people, when they get mad, they become domestic terrorists. That's Black Lives Matter. That's Antifa. We can see already the LGBT community has already attacked anyone who doesn't put up the dark side of the rainbow symbol on the front of their store. These are people who are in a war. So we are supporting the minority to war against the majority. And where does it come from? The City of London. So I said earlier to you, we should get rid of the United Nations. Well, that's true. We should. And somebody should run on nothing but that platform in America. If you annihilate the United Nations, it will help. But until you annihilate the City of London, you're not going to stop this type of economic warfare.
Right. Because this is whatever is being paid for is what we need to focus on. And since the banks are the ones providing the cash to sustain these nonsensical standards, they're creating their own echo chamber that will reward. It reminds me of when I was working in the Soviet Union. One of the things that is quite obvious to anybody who worked there is that the Communist Party had watchers everywhere and literally had watchers down to somebody sitting in a desk next to you in an engineering company who was reporting on you and making sure you complied with the party's behavior. This was standard fare. They had it in education, had it in commerce, banking, everything. this reminds me of the same thing, only this time it's going to be digitally. And the what's the mouthpiece here? The mouthpiece for this mechanism is incessant propaganda. And that's what we just discovered here, is that these advocates for these ESG standards are nothing but PR companies. They don't do any work. They monitor for compliance, and then they push out whatever message they need to through um, the different disinformation activities within the banks and within the country, and they create the mess that then the Mockingbird press picks up on, and then forces the rest of the country to spend a certain amount of time fighting against that. And what they're trying to do is get to our pocketbooks, because as soon as they can get to our pocketbooks, they think they will silence the people that are currently fighting against them. And I think that is something that has to be resisted.
Absolutely. And as Tyler pointed out, this is ESG-ism. It's nothing more than another British ism, socialism, welfareism. You know, John Ruskin's welfareism or welfare houses, the Jeremy Bentham socialism, the Labour Party. This is the panacea for the masses to try to tell them exactly like the socialist, exactly like the communist always told the plebeians. We are going to create no hunger, no poverty. We're going to create good, clean water
Oh
for you.
yeah,
Oh, wonderful goals, all lies.
Douglas. They had these propaganda stores where you could go in and buy these posters that were really well done, and some of them quite artful. And in that, they were describing this nirvana that communism was supposedly bringing to the people. But that's because they did more of that because it wasn't working. They didn't have that, and yet the people were being shoved all this propaganda, print propaganda. Well, now they have it digitally, so they don't need to have those stores.
The British chartered and crown approved Bank of Athens that then went to Smyrna and controlled the opium trade through the Boston Brahmins and also to the east, controlled basically the last remnants of the Silk Road, which is gold, silver manipulation, human trafficking, slavery, opium dealing. So then it goes to Australia to hide it, and then he comes to America, and now he's the hero that people want to elect as the president.
Yep.
This is nothing more than the same old British nonsense that we've seen for a long, long time. And they absorbed it from, of course, the Babylonian Radonites. So the Pilgrim Society and Jamie Dimon, the manipulation of silver and gold, of drugs, of humans, this is nothing more than the British East India Company. It's nothing
Right.
more than the British South Africa Company. It's nothing more than the Dutch East India Company finally folded into the Dutch government. But the point is that this is happening now. This isn't some kind of pie in the sky imagination. These are isms that control our life. Capitalism, it's a myth. There's no capitalism in America. There's no free markets. When Jamie Dimon will talk about free markets, complete insanity. There are no free markets. And remember, these are government corporate monopolies. These huge companies receive huge influx of money from our government. It's like Elon Musk. People think he's a great inventor. 40% of the money that have created his companies came from the US government taxpayer dollars.
Right.
It's kind of like AOC said the other day, you know, they need to stop taking this money out of the citizens' taxes and just take it from the government.
There
This
we
is the
go.
stupidity that we're talking about, that these people, who could believe ESG is real? It's not real. It's a war, as you've pointed out, on many different levels, using false goals as nothing more than another Hegelian dialectic. Create the
Right.
problem, give a solution, come back to the middle, which you always knew the middle was going to be the same thing, support the banking oligarchs.
We have this on this illustration that we'll be publishing. What they've created is perpetual control of thesis, antithesis, synthesis topics. So they created those topics. They've got this systemized now, and now they're just going to push, push, push as those topics then become accounted for. And that's why they need this carbon credit, because that will be probably the only thing that could actually put a number to most of these activities and find an equation between political spending, for example, and carbon credits. And they'll just do that across the board, and then they have a new system.
These are godless worshipers of Satan, of Mammon, of Baal, of Baphomet, of all the different demons there are, because the people at the top that we're talking about do not believe in God, do not believe in immortality. They do not believe in heaven or hell. They believe in only themselves right now, getting as much as they can. And a Jamie Dimon, who was basically groomed to be in that position. He's no smarter than
Most
anybody else.
definitely.
It was his family who got him into it, and it was the British monarchy and the City of London that has controlled it to this very day, and we are underneath their thumb. And ESG is in fact just a new form of communism that has a lot of characteristics of economic fascism, and
Right.
we just need to stand against it. We need to say sever all relationships with the United Nations and anything international, anything transnational, and specifically anything British.